Today we have some more actual history about the Indian slayer Tom Quick. We will hear about the final Indian that he killed around 1784 or 1785, when Tom was about 50 years old. This occurred a couple years after peace had been declared, following the end of the Revolutionary War. It also occurred after Tom had been held captive by the Indians in his cabin, and had escaped in the night, before the Indians could take him to their camp and torture him to death. The Indians left and took all of Tom's furs, and he was very angry about the incident. So even though peace had been declared, Tom was still very much at war with the Indians. We will be reading from this book, Tom Quick, the Indian Slayer. This book was published by James Quinlan all the way back in 1851. So here's the story of the last victim of Tom Quick, the Indian Slayer. Not long after Tom was taken prisoner on the Lackawaxen, two Indians came to what is now the town of Lumberland to hunt and fish. The name of one was Canopy. Canopy was a native of Cochecton. He and his mother lived with his grandfather, whose name was Abraham, in a swamp near the Russo Brook. The other Indian was called Cochecton or Ben Shanks. Previous to the war, they had frequently been at Minisink, particularly Canopy, who was a fine specimen of his race, and had been highly esteemed by his white neighbors. Ben Shanks, it is said, was the tallest Indian ever seen on the Delaware, and probably from this circumstance received his name. During hostilities, they had taken an active part in favor of King George, and had accompanied several of the ruthless expeditions of the Tories and Indians against the Whigs of Wawasink and Minisink. Cochecton was bold, crafty, and cunning, and on one occasion had penetrated Wawasink, and nearly succeeded in taking prisoner Colonel Jansen, a noted patriot. Shanks was distinguished for his barbarous murders, and was very obnoxious to the Whigs on account of the part he had taken in the murder of John Mack, and the two young ladies who were killed on the Shawangunk. At the time the circumstances detailed in this chapter occurred, a majority of the white families who had located themselves in Cochecton previous to the war had returned, and again lived on their farms. Some of them were old acquaintances of Canopy and Cochecton. The Indians stopped on their way down to renew the friendly relations which had existed previous to the late troubles. One of the men they called to see was Joseph Ross, who lived near the mouth of the Callicoon, and some of whose descendants still reside in Cochecton. Ross appears to have been a humane man. He advised Canopy and Shanks to go no further, and told them their lives would be in danger if they went below, as there were some desperate characters there, Tom Quick among the number, who would rejoice at an opportunity to kill them. A man named Josiah Parks gave them the same advice. The two Indians were experienced and brave warriors, however, and knew not what fear was. They had lurked about the houses of the Whigs when war existed, and they imagined it would now be cowardly to turn back from fear. Saying that it was peacetime and they did not think the whites would hurt them, they went to the ponds in the vicinity of Handsome Eddy, where they fished and hunted, but carefully avoided the settlers and others. While they were thus engaged, they were discovered by a man named Ben, or Benjamin Haynes, who lived at the eddy. He professed to be friendly, and told them that if they would go with him to the river, they might make his house their home. They declined at first, but he promised to protect them. This Haynes, as the result will prove, was a dastardly wretch. He was as barbarous as a savage, but did not possess a single trait which partially redeems the Indian character. The murders of Quick may shock us, but the mean treachery of Haynes can elicit no other feeling than that of abhorrence and contempt. While the Indians were at his house, Haynes pretended that it was necessary for him to go to Minisink after rum and ammunition. The real object of his journey was to see Tom, and induce him to go to the eddy and murder his guests. It is said that he wished to get possession of the furs which the Indians had brought with them. He found the old Indian slayer, who was yet wild with rage on account of having been robbed of his skins, at the cabin on the Lackawaxen. Tom readily listened to Haynes and agreed to kill the Indians, provided he could get someone to assist, for he thought it advisable not to attempt to cope with Cochecton and Canopy alone, as it was well known that they were each nearly equal to him in cunning and bravery. Among Tom's friends was a man named Kobe Chambers, or Shimer, who had formerly lived in Rochester or Shawangunk, and was an acquaintance of the two young ladies who had been so barbarously slain by Shanks and his party. It is not too much to suppose that he was a lover of one of them, or a near relative, as he readily agreed to assist Tom in killing the guest of Haines, although, as the event proved, he was unused to scenes of blood. If this were not so, why should he, who had never before engaged in any affair in which the life of an Indian was involved, now in a time of profound peace, engage in an attempt to destroy two of the hated race, one of whom was regarded with so much abhorrence because he had shed the blood of the two innocent and offensive girls? After conferring with Tom, Haines went home, with the understanding that the Indian slayer should follow in a day or two and bring Scheimer with him. Haines found Canopy and his companion still at his cabin when he returned. Quick and Scheimer reached the eddy a day or two after Haines got there. They found the latter and the Indians in the cabin waiting for their morning meal, which the woman of the house was preparing for them. Ben professed to be surprised at their coming, and greeted Tom as an old acquaintance, but gave him a fictitious name, so that the Indians, who had never seen him before, would not know who he was. After inquiring where they were going, etc., he invited them to eat breakfast with him, which after a little urging they agreed to do. While Ben's wife was putting the dishes on the table, he filled a bowl with water, and taking it outdoors put it on a stump a rod or two from the house. He then returned and told the Indians to wash themselves. They went out of doors for that purpose, and Haines had a brief opportunity to confer with Tom and Scheimer. He told them that he would get the Indians to go with him unarmed to the fish rocks, to catch fish, and that the opportunity to shoot them at that place would be good, as there was a convenient clump of bushes close by from which to fire. Tom expressed his satisfaction with what Haines had said. The Indians came back into the house and all sat down and ate a hearty breakfast. Tom and Ben seemed to be perfectly at ease all the time, as if nothing more than usual was on their minds, while Kobe appeared to be disconcerted. After breakfast, the newcomers apparently resumed their journey up the river. They were soon in ambush, however, near the place where Ben said he would entice the Indians. Not long after this, Haikon, Canopy, and Haines, and a little son of the latter, came to the rocks and began to fish. Before Tom and his companion fired, it occurred to Haines that his son might be injured in the affray, and he ordered him to go home. Something in the manner of Haines caused the Indians to suspect his fidelity, but he quickly quieted their suspicions, and the three continued to angle as before. Canopy having broken his hook, and none of the party being in possession of one to give him, laid down on the rocks near Shanks, with his head resting upon his hand and elbow. This was considered a favorable opportunity by Tom and Scheimer, and they took aim. Kobe, who was not accustomed to such business, was greatly excited, and Tom declared afterwards that his, Kobe's, hand trembled so that he heard the barrel of his gun rattle against the log on which it rested. They fired. Tom's ball passed through the hand and the lower part of the head of Canopy, wounding him severely. Scheimer, as might have been safely predicted, did not hit Shanks. The wounded man ran to Haines and claimed the protection which had been promised, but instead of granting it, the wretch seized a pine knot, shouting, "Think how you used to kill white folks! I'll send your soul to hell in a moment!" and then dispatched him by beating out his brains. Even Tom, familiar as he was with scenes of blood, was shocked at the perfidy of Haines. He came up as the latter was dealing out his blows and exclaimed, "Damn a man who will promise an Indian protection and then knock him on the head." Shanks, when he heard the report of the guns, jumped into the river and pretended to be wounded and drowning, until the current had carried him downstream a short distance, to a place where the bank was covered with bushes. Here he scrambled on shore and ran off limping, hallooing and groaning as if in great agony. The ruse did not deceive Tom, however, who, finding that Shanks was traveling pretty fast for a man who was apparently so badly wounded, started in pursuit, loading his rifle as he ran, and soon got sufficiently near to fire. At the moment he snapped his gun, Shanks looked back, and as Tom shot, fell. The Indian afterwards said that he dodged at the flash of the gun. Be that as it may, Tom did not hit him. A ball hole was afterward found through his blankets, but whether it was made by Tom or Kobe could not be ascertained. After the last discharge of the gun, Haikon took to his heels in earnest, and Tom found that his shanks were neither active nor long enough to overtake him. He returned to the rock, saying, If ever legs did service, it was them. Another narrator of this affair says, sometime in 1784, 3 Indians came to the house of Joseph Ross. Their names were Nicholas, Ben Shanks, and Canopy. While they stayed there, they amused themselves by shooting across the river at a large chestnut tree, which is still standing. They several times went from the house of Ross to David Young's. In doing this, they passed my father's place, which gave me frequent opportunities to see them. How long they remained in the neighborhood I am unable to say. After they left, we heard nothing more about them, until the report came that Canopy had been killed at Handsome Eddy. The report was that Ben, Haynes, and Scheimer, in a hunting expedition, discovered these Indians on the waters of the Shohola, where they had encamped, and were just commencing to trap for beaver. Haynes, having been well acquainted with them before the war, accosted them in the most friendly manner, calling them brothers, and assuring them that he was overjoyed to find in them his old associates. The Indians having just killed a deer, the whole party healthily and amicably partook of a meal of venison. After this, the Indians invited their brother Palefaces to visit them again, and Haynes invited his brother Redmen to visit him. They thus parted on apparent friendly terms. The white men had gone but a short distance before Scheimer proposed to return, kill the Indians, and take their traps and rifles. To this Haynes replied that it would be too dangerous, that they could not expect to kill more than 2 at the first shots, that there would be 1 left with 3 loaded rifles, while theirs would be empty, and that he would shoot both of them before they could reload. Let them catch the beaver and other game, said he, and then we can get Cousin Tom to help us. He will be delighted to have a chance to kill them. So when they supposed the Indians had caught the game and prepared the skins, they applied to Cousin Tom. To their surprise, he refused to go into the woods where there were Indians. He consented, however, to assist them if Haynes would entice the Indians to the river. Accordingly, Haynes prevailed on 2 of them to come out, by agreeing to protect them and take their furs to Minisink, and exchange them for such articles as they needed. After he had got them to his house, he induced them to go with him to fish on a certain rock, where, by a preconcerted plan, Scheimer and Quick were in ambush. As soon as the Indians were in a convenient position, the 2 white men fired. Scheimer's bullet took effect and wounded Canopy, but Quick missed his Indian, who escaped. Canopy ran to Brother Ben for protection when the latter said, "Pant, damn you, for you have not a minute to live," and then knocked him on the head with a pine knot. Scheimer was taken and put in jail, where he remained some time but was finally liberated. Haynes and Tom skulked about from one place to another to keep out of the reach of the sheriffs and constables until Scheimer was set at liberty, when they again came out boldly among the people. Scheimer, while imprisoned, complained much of the unfairness of keeping him confined, while Ben and Tom, who were equally culpable, were permitted to be at large. 2 weeks had elapsed since the Indians passed through Cochecton, when Shanks returned alone, damning the Yankees for killing Canopy, and swearing that they would suffer for what they had done. He was first seen at a house a short distance from Cochecton Bridge, where he stopped to rest and get something to eat. While he was there, Mrs. Drake, whose father-in-law, the first and second husband, were killed by Indians and Tories, came into the house. Almost immediately after seeing Shanks, she fainted. So great was her dread of those who had slain so many of her near and dear friends. He was next seen by Mr. Joseph Ross, who invited him to tarry a while at his house, but he refused to come near Ross at first, the bad faith of Haynes having caused him to suspect every paleface. He finally consented, however, to stay with him a short time. He was treated kindly by Mr. Ross and his neighbors. While here, his conduct afforded much amusement to the juvenile members of the family. Mr. Ross and his hands were hoeing corn, and every time they went to their work, Shanks accompanied them. As soon as he got to the field, he selected the highest ground in it, and after glancing rapidly and suspiciously over the surrounding country, he seated himself a la Turk among the waving and rustling corn, where he remained out of sight for 15 or 20 minutes. He would then jump upon his feet, get upon the tips of his toes, stretch his neck upward as far as possible, look around as if expecting to see Tom, and then squat upon his haunches again. As long as he remained in the field, he acted this way. The boys could compare him to nothing but a rather vigilant and somewhat alarmed turkey-cock. After remaining a day or two, he continued his journey homeward to relate another great wrong committed by the white men. He left Ross breathing threats of vengeance, and was ferried across the Delaware at Equinuk by Mr. Parks, who has already been mentioned. The death of Canopy was regretted by most of the frontier settlers for many reasons. His murder was brought about by the blackest treachery, and was in violation of a solemn treaty of peace, the strict observance of which was necessary to their safety. Nothing could justify the murder. It was known that others besides Tom were engaged in the transaction, and there was good ground to fear that the Indians would avenge his death, and in doing so not discriminate between the bloody perpetrators of the outrage and those who would have sheltered him from harm. Gradually after this event, the fears of the pioneers wore away, and finally they continued to fish and hunt and cultivate their lands without apprehension. For several years after the restoration of peace, Cochecton presented a curious scene. The settlers, old and new, were struggling under many disadvantages to make comfortable livings for themselves and those who were dependent upon them. Fishing, hunting, farming, rafting, anything of the kind which promised to yield a good return in food, clothing, or what was considered of more importance, money, was freely resorted to. Yet notwithstanding they had so many strings to their bow, meager want sometimes strode into their dwellings, and laid his withering hand upon them. This occurred generally when there was a freshet of long continuance, which rendered it impossible to get to Minisink, where they had to get their corn and rye and buckwheat manufactured into meal and flour. During such a calamity the people were very kind to each other. Without hesitation they divided their last crust, and trusted in Providence for the next. So great was the scarcity of food at times, that women and children, after traveling miles through the forest to procure something to save themselves from starvation, upon receiving a few ears of corn, would gnaw the raw kernels from the cobs with swine-like voracity. Even while the people of Cochecton were thus laboring under all the inconveniences and deprivations of a new and secluded locality, they were seized with a mania to push still further into the wilderness. Strange tales were told of the extraordinary fertility and beauty of the Great West. The Sciota, the Muskingum, and other regions where their old neighbors the Indians had gone, became words synonymous with Eden and El Dorado. Great as were the natural advantages of the country bordering on the Ohio River, speculators and others whose interest it was to induce emigrants to go there, made the uninitiated believe that the region was 100 times better than it really was, and thousands of eager and enthusiastic adventurers were soon thronging the military roads, Indian paths, and navigable rivers. Among those who emigrated from Cochecton to the country bordering on the Ohio were Abraham Russ and a man named Van Etten. They had married sisters and both had families. Van Etten left Cochecton first. He built a cabin and cleared some lands. During the next spring or summer, Russ and his family followed, and were staying with Van Etten until a shelter could be provided for them. The united families consisted of the men we have named, their wives, their mother-in-law who was bedridden, and their children, 8 or 9 in number, one of whom, Cyrus Russ, had reached the stature of a man, while the youngest was a babe. A young man whose name we have not learned was also an occupant of the cabin. Van Etten went off into the woods one morning, probably for the purpose of shooting a deer. At noon, while he was gone and all the others were present, 5 Indians came to the house, and as they did not appear unfriendly, they were invited to eat, which invitation they did not decline. Mrs. Russ and her sister were fearful that the Indians were not well disposed, and watched them closely. When the Indians had finished their meal, the women saw them thrust their knives into their belts, instead of the sheaths in which they usually carried them, and from which they could not be drawn as readily as from their belts. When this was observed, the 2 women spoken of, to use their own expressive language, knew that their visitors were for war. Perhaps this idea had suggested itself to Mr. Russ, who was sitting with an axe in his hands on the edge of the bed, upon which was his sick mother-in-law and the infant, which was Mrs. Van Etten's. He pretended to be doing something to the handle. While he was thus occupied, the Indians, to the surprise of all, began to inquire about the people of Cochecton, and particularly concerning Captain Bezaleel Tyler and Moses Thomas II, both of whom were killed at the Battle of Minisink, and one of whom had been much hated by the Tories and Indians, so much so that they had bestowed upon him an opprobrious Indian name. It was notorious to all who knew anything about Cochecton that these men were dead, and when the Indians began to make inquiries concerning them, and that too in tones of half-concealed exultation, Mrs. Russ and Mrs. Van Etten were still more alarmed than when they saw the Indians put their knives where they could get them in a melee with the least difficulty. While the Indians were thus asking questions, the eldest daughter of Russ noticed with alarm that one of them was getting nearer and nearer her father, and that he was evidently watching for a favorable opportunity to tomahawk him. She immediately seated herself on the bed beside him, and attempted to tell him in a whisper to be on his guard. He imprudently turned his head toward her to hear what she had to say, when he was laid dead at her side. The Indian who had been watching for a chance to strike him dashed his tomahawk into the brain of the unfortunate man, the moment his eye was directed towards his daughter. The instant this was done, one of the Indians rushed to the door to prevent the escape of any of the inmates. Before he had time to raise his tomahawk, however, to menace those who came that way, Mrs. Russ and her sister sprang against him, pushed him from the door, and got out. The moment Mrs. Van Etten had escaped from the cabin, she remembered her sleeping babe, and that she had abandoned it to the brutal and cruel Indians. The thought maddened her. Without thinking of the consequences which would result to herself, acting from the strong, affectionate instinct of the mother, she attempted to force her way into the cabin and bring away her infant. As she attempted to cross the threshold, the Indian who guarded the door mimed a blow at her head, which would have ended her earthly career if she had not fortunately turned the aim of her assailant aside with her hands. As it was, the blade of the tomahawk was buried in one of her cheeks, causing her to carry a hideous scar as long as she lived upon that part of her person, which so many vain fair ones bedeck and bedaub with paints and cosmetics. Rendered almost blind by her own blood, the unhappy and half-distracted mother staggered beyond the reach of the swarthy barbarian, and ultimately crawled into the woods close by, where she indulged all the heart-rending emotions of grief. The moment Cyrus Ross saw his father fall under the blow of the Indian who killed him, almost with the speed of thought he caught the axe from the hands of his dying parents, and with it split open the head of the murderer. He then turned to the nearest Indian, and before he had received a single wound himself, he slew him also. It is supposed he wounded the third one before he was killed. While the heroic son was thus avenging the death of his father, the nameless young man of whom we have spoken seemed paralyzed with fear. He stood bolt upright near the fireplace without attempting to escape or resist, exhibiting a picture of astonishment and despair. After Cyrus was killed, it does not appear that this young man even raised his hand to ward off the blow which was directed at his own head. He was knocked down and fell senseless and lifeless within the fireplace, after which the ferocious murderers stamped his dead body into the ashes. They then went to the bed, where the poor old decrepit woman was lying, a helpless and horrified spectator of the awful scene, and tomahawked her. After doing this, they took the infant of Mrs. Van Etten, and dashed its brains out against the jamb of the fireplace. The children who were younger than Cyrus providentially escaped. At the commencement of the melee, and while the Indians were engaged with young Russ, they ran up a ladder into the garrets. The Indians did not attempt to stop them, probably having as much work on hand as they cared for, or perhaps supposing that after they had slaughtered the men, they would take the young people from their retreats, and kill them at their leisure. If they expected to accomplish the destruction of the mission, however, they were mistaken. There was an opening in the walls of the garrets, from which the girls leaped to the ground, and then fled, first bidding their brothers to follow, and telling them that they would be killed if they did not. The boys, however, did not at once leave the garrets. Their curiosity was greater than their fear. They watched the proceedings below through the cracks in the garret floor, until the infant was killed. When thinking the Indians would next be after them, they followed their sisters, and escaped to the woods, where all the members of the family who succeeded in getting from the hut concealed themselves. It was from the boys that the particulars of what took place during the latter part of the massacre were derived. When the Indians had killed all they could put their hands upon, and after setting fire to the cabin, they left the premises without attempting to search the woods where the frightened fugitives were cowering behind tree trunks and in the thick underbrush. Just as the Indians were going off, Mr. Van Etten returned. He discovered that they were hostile from the fact that they had set fire to his dwelling. He prudently concealed himself until the coast was clear, when he ventured forth to save as much of his property as he could, and to do what was possible and necessary for the living and the dead. One after another of the survivors collected around him during the afternoon and evening, and he provided for and guarded them as well as he could. The widow and her surviving children were subsequently brought back to Cochecton by Benjamin Jones, who had married a daughter of Mr. Russ before the latter left the valley of the Delaware. Mrs. Russ subsequently was married to George Hawk, one of whose daughters married John Crow. The gentleman who gave us the foregoing particulars closed his interesting narrative with the remark that the widow Russ turned to a hawk, and one of the hawk's young ones became a crow. A daughter of Mr. Hawk, it is said, was the mother of Bishop Bascom of the Methodist Episcopal Church. It is told that the murder of Canopy and the negligence of the whites in bringing Quick, Haynes, and Scheimer to punishments led the Indians to commit this outrage. Many outrages were committed on the frontiers by both races at that time, and a war followed, which Mad Anthony Wayne closed by a brilliant victory on the banks of the Maumee. So that's it for this episode about the last Indian that Tom Quick slayed. This included two slightly different accounts of the killing of Canopy. In one, Tom Quick killed him, but in the second story it was Scheimer who killed Canopy, while Tom missed. Let us know which version you think is correct in the comments. To me it seems unlikely that Tom would be the one who missed. It's also interesting that Scheimer went to jail for at least a short period of time, but Tom and Ben did not. This story also made clear that many of the townspeople were not happy about what Tom had done, because it led to retribution by the Indians, like the massacre against the Russ and Van Etten families. This may have been the reason why this was the last Indian that Tom killed. It was not popular, and Scheimer had spent time in jail for it. Tom ended up living about 11 more years after this, so it seems like he decided to no longer avenge his father's death by killing Indians. We will have one more episode after this about some events that occurred during the final years of Tom Quick's life. His battles against Indians were over, but he would still face one more battle against some wild animals. So stay tuned to this channel for more actual history about people like Tom Quick. This channel is called Unworthy History because we cover actual history that has now been deemed unworthy to discuss on history channels on TV. Here on this channel, our mission is to preserve actual history by reading directly from old books. If you'd like to support our mission at this channel, then you can become a Patreon or YouTube channel member. Members will have full access to all of our members-only videos, and your contribution towards keeping actual history alive will be recognized at the end of each episode. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.